Okay, I think I'm recording again. So again, this is Professor TOVANCHE. Today we're going to finish up, I hope finish up with um, Black Revolutionaries. Um, all of this takes a very, very long time to get through, this section in particular, because there's so much going on. At any rate, I think the last thing that we were talking about, and I know I ended the last presentation kind of abruptly, without signing off, but what I was talking about at the time was about how slaves and Black people generally were embracing this new sort of religion, right? Um, Evangelicalism. We talked about how they took the religion and made it their own, and for them it was became part of their identity, a sense of survival, a place within God's universe, and so forth, right? And of course, all of this is also tied to a growing sense of equality. For Black people, they're thinking spiritual equality may, in fact, mean something else. It may mean political or even social equality. Of course, this frightens a lot of white people, and they don't like the fact that these ideas are floating around in the heads of black people. But again, the slaves, the black people, free Black people, and slaves, they don't sit idly by. They're going to forge their own lives, and in a sense, this makes them revolutionary. And all of this is tied to the American Revolution, which we're going to talk about now. The American Revolution has long roots. In the decades that were leading up to the Revolution, uh, Europeans were fighting over the New World, over the continent, the Americas, and English victories actually would bring new challenges. For example, one of these wars between England and another power was the French and Indian War. Here's where England was fighting against the native peoples and the French. And they were fighting. This was largely a world war, really called the 7 Years' War. But for our purposes, we're going to say French and Indian War because we're talking about what happened here in the Americas. Well, this French and Indian War lasts from 1754 to 1763. Notice it ends just before the American Revolution, and it's really the war that gets us the Revolution, because with this French and Indian War, it reveals the divisions between colonists and the motherland. It creates new problems. After the French and Indian War, the crown, meaning the king, right, needs money. It has an army. It needs to pay for an army to protect a larger area because, by the way, England wins this war, picks up a lot of new land all the way out from the seaboard to the Mississippi River. Now, I'm not going to go to this is maybe some review for some of you. I'm trying to give sort of a background so that the other things that I talk about will make sense with regard to African American history. I think it's important, though, to give this sort of quick and dirty kind of synopsis of what happened. Now, the French and Indian War, as I mentioned, will reveal some divisions and create some new divisions. Because England wins this war and actually picks up a lot of territory, it needs money. It needs money to run the territory, to protect it, first of all, with a large army, but also to run it, right? Because you need officials and you need to pay these guys to, run, trade and customs and just run the government. So all of this is costly. The war itself was costly. And in fact, colonists contributed very little to the victory. They did some, but the war was really fought by the English, not the English colonists so much, fought by the English and paid for by the English. It's not to say that the colonists did not participate at all. They did, but very often a lot of men didn't want to fight, and very often colonies didn't want to give money for the war. And there's lots of reasons for that we don't need to get into. You should probably watch the movie Last of the Mohicans. That was a really good movie. I liked it anyway. Based on a novel by, is it James Fenimore Cooper, I think? I don't really remember. But the movie's good, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. And it's all set at this time of the French and Indian War. Point is, a lot of colonists didn't want to fight, and colonies did not want to pay money. And so England looks at this and says, well, this war actually benefited you because it did. It opened up more land for people to settle. And they say, you made a lot of money from this war because In fact, the colonists were trading with the enemy during the war. Um, and you picked up the trade with the native peoples that the French no longer have because the French are gone now because, thank you very much. We got rid of them for you. Again, this is all the crown's point of view. So the crown looks at all these things and says, okay, you didn't really help us. You gained a lot. And I'm going to have to tax you. And so they start to tax these people. And these are people, the amount of the tax wasn't the problem. The problem was that they started to tax people that they had let actually for a very long time grow apart from the king. These people had come from strong-willed stock. These are people from the Protestant Reformation. These are the people who talked about the rights of Englishmen. These are the people who had immigrant grit, and they had grown apart from their king. They had grown apart from their king because they were so far away, and for a long time they were allowed to develop their own institutions, their local government, and so forth. And again, this is all quick and dirty stuff, guys. I'm not gonna really ask you about this. I really just want you guys to understand sort of the background. But here's something interesting is that they had grown apart from the king also because of the Great Awakening. Remember, during the Great Awakening, there's all kinds of new religions that are sort of shaping up, and these new religions are not the king's religion. So if you can question a person's religion, you can also question that person's power over you. So the Enlightenment had something to do with this. I'm sorry, the Great Awakening had something to do with this, but also the Enlightenment had something to do with this. Around this time, Europe is engaged in this age of enlightenment where you don't rely on religion necessary to explain things. You use your brain, reason. You are skeptical of everything, and you as an individual are in fact capable of figuring things out on your own. So along with this age of enlightenment, this age of reason, comes the questioning of the established order and even established government. And a prime example of this, of course, is John Locke, who I think I mentioned before. He talks about limited government, right? And he talks about natural rights. Now, these are important because if you think about it from, for example, Black people's point of view, slaves also, as well as free people, think about what they're hearing. When they're hearing white folk talk about natural rights, life, liberty, and John Locke would say life, liberty, and property, when they hear them talk about limited government and individualism, they're going to breathe these things in. And so keep that in the back of your mind as we move through this. I just kind of want to finish talking about the Great Awakening and the Enlightenment very briefly. The Great Awakening and the Enlightenment, they're very different from each other, right? Because on the one hand, one is religious, obviously, the Great Awakening, and the other is secular, meaning non-religious, basically, of this world, right? One is emotional, the Great Awakening, religious movement. One is rational, right? You use your mind, not your heart. So they're very different, but they're both, interestingly, the same because they both are about individuality. On the one hand, the Great Awakening says, give yourself, make an individual choice to have an individual relationship with God. On the other hand, people who believe in the Enlightenment say, you have an individual mind. You can use your own mind as an individual, and therefore you should not always follow the crowd. So both of these point to the same thing, individuality. They both point to questioning of authority. As I mentioned before, if you can question somebody's religion, you can question his authority over you. The other thing is, under the Enlightenment principle, if you can question somebody's conclusions about something because you have the power of reason, then you can also question their authority over you. So all of these things, both of these things together, will threaten the established order. So as white colonists are drawing on these ideas and taking steps toward revolution, Black people they're breathing all of this stuff in. They will breathe in the talk of freedom, the talk of equality, all that stuff that they hear around them. And they already have a sense of it for themselves, but they're going to key in on what these white folk are saying and start thinking, well, what makes you better than me in terms of, first of all, religion and in terms of individual thinking, but also why is it that you deserve freedom and I don't? So Black folk are themselves going to be keyed into the revolution, and they will take sides, and they're going to become instrumental in the war for independence. You know, Black people in the North are going to embrace revolutionary rhetoric, revolutionary talk, right? Black people are going to forge, and this is, of course, is Black people who are free or not, but this, of course, is especially true in the North among free people. But Black people are going to forge new ideas, and they're gonna have new weapons in their arsenal, revolutionary weapons. They're gonna have the language of the revolution, right? When they talk about freedom and equality, they're gonna have the Enlightenment there. They're gonna talk about limited government and natural rights. They're gonna make these ideas, this revolution, their own, and they're gonna make their own demands. They had heard all this talk about revolution. They had seen how white people around them had talked about being enslaved by the British. They say, you people are talking about being enslaved by the British, but I mean, look around, man. Who's the real slave here, right? And they call out the hypocrisy of white folk. We're going to talk more about this, but keep this in the back of your mind. They had also seen Black folk, especially in the North, engage in local government, right? So they hear them talk about being enslaved by the British, and they hear them talk about, uh, about local government, local rule, individuality, um, and sort of this idea of the self, and you know, throwing off the chains of tyranny. I mean, from the slave's point of view, and Black people generally, you can say, but literally for slaves, you're talking about real shackles of tyranny. So for them, it's this hypocrisy is just too much. Um, so you're going to see Black people, both free and enslaved, sort of thinking about these things. In New England, slaves had breathed these ideas in, and they had already, interestingly, formed their own rituals that would mirror whites' own practices for local government. What do I mean by that? Well, in New England, you had something called Negro Election Day. This was a sort of ceremonial. It wasn't real. It wasn't official. The government of the northern colonies, they're not going to recognize this as official. But slaves would come together and have a ceremonial election of Black leaders. They would elect so-called kings and governors. I'm doing air quotes here for kings and governors, right, of the Black community. They would elect these people. They would hold parties and parades and what they would consider to be, quote unquote, official swearing in ceremonies. All of this, of course, is a parody of white practices and behaviors with regard to local government. We know that slaves were kept out of the white elections. There's no voting for slaves in the North, even. And so, what we're seeing here is people coming from miles around, right, and engaging in this sort of political theater, really, is what it is. Or it looks like politics, but it's not. And in fact, as I said, it's sort of a parody of what white folk do. But the point is, they understand this idea of self-rule. They understand the idea of elections and maybe even a hierarchy. In fact, they understood the hierarchy because the people who were elected as kings or governors, for example, were usually those Africans who had royal blood or who claimed to have royal blood. The point is, they're sort of taking this idea of African lineage, right, and royal blood, and sort of attaching it to this sort of election process that they've seen happening around them. And so there's a recognition of this hierarchy, and the recognition also that that they can choose the leader. But of course, they choose the leader whom they believe. So that, see the mixing going on. They choose a leader, but they choose a leader who has or claims to have royal blood. What's interesting also is that the recognition of all of this, even though it's not official by the colony, there are white folk who recognize these kings and governors in a sense. These people who are elected as kings and governors in New England to sort of, lead their people, these kings and governors sometimes speak to white folk on behalf of the black community. And so they have some power, these people. They have power in a sense because they act as intermediaries in some instances between slaves in New England and white folk in the region. And within their own community, these kings slash governors, whatever, they actually preside over disputes between slaves with regard to, for example, any sort of disagreement that slaves might have with each other, or any sort of petty crime that one is accused of committing on the other. But this, of course, is only internal, right? This is internal. If a slave is accused by a white person of doing something, that's going to be outside of this purview, outside of this person's sort of realm. But what it does show is a sense of community among slaves. And it also, as I mentioned, shows the sense of there's of course a mixing going on here because they're mixing the African tradition of lineage with a political sort of election. And all of this is tied to the idea of identity and even a sense of revolution. And I should talk more about what revolution means. Revolution doesn't necessarily mean a fight. It doesn't necessarily mean you use guns. That's how we often interpret it and we think of it. But a revolution really is a turn, right? A revolution is a turn. The idea of a revolution is that, you begin at one point and then society turns away from where it should be and it goes in this circle. I'm drawing a circle in the air here. You can't see that, but it goes in. Imagine a clock, right? The old timey clocks, right? From 12 to 3 to 6 to 9 to back to 12, right? So you go from 12 down to 3, down to 6. You're getting farther and farther away from where you should be, right? But eventually you take it all the way back up to 12. Now that's the point of revolution where people want to get back to and those are natural rights as I understand them. And so revolution doesn't necessarily mean you use guns. It doesn't you fight a war. It means you go back, you return. Somehow the society returns to the best state within which people can live. And that is, of course, a sense of belonging in a community, but also a sense of individuality and freedom and natural rights. So what I'm saying is that all of this is tied to this idea of revolution. And black people know this. When war comes, northern black men are going to fight and die in the war. Slaves will volunteer. Sometimes they're going to be sent by their masters because their masters don't want to fight, and they're going to send these slaves to fight in their own place, but they're going to be there. They're going to be fighting. And of course, you're going to see free men also volunteering to fight. Free black men join the Minutemen. You've heard of the Minutemen who fought at Lexington, right? This was Lexington and then, of course, Concord. These are the very first skirmishes of the war. And so free black men joined the Minutemen to push the British back at Lexington. And of course, I'm sure you know, right? The Minutemen were, these men who were presumably ready to fight in a minute's notice. An example of one of these guys is a guy named Lemuel Hayes. He fights for what he says is the freedom of men. He fights for freedom of men, and he counts himself among these men, obviously. And he actually adds to Thomas Jefferson's, after the war jumps off and everything, right? Thomas Jefferson, we know, writes in 1776 that all men are created equal. Well, he writes an addendum to the Declaration of Independence. An addendum just means this addition to, right? He writes an addendum to Thomas Jefferson's all men are created equal speech, drawing on Enlightenment thinking, calling for an end to slavery. He's saying, look, this Declaration of Independence, man, it in fact means that if all men are created equal, then all men are created equal. So anyway, Lemuel Hayes fights at Lexington. He will later on call for an end to slavery using, of course, Enlightenment thinking and drawing on the Declaration of Independence, which itself relies on Enlightenment thinking. So after Lexington, black men are going to be accepted into the Massachusetts militia. Every colony has its own militia, right? A militia is kind of like what today would be the National Guard, right? Every state has an armed force. So they're accepted into the Massachusetts militia. Why? Because they need men. They need men. Not everybody's happy about this. Not everybody's happy about the fact that black men are carrying guns. But this is the North. It's not the South, and they need help. And so you're going to see in places like New York and Rhode Island, free black men enlisting in Northern militia, in these militia colonies, sometimes offering freedom to those slaves who will fight. Many just run away from their owners to fight because of this. And so you're going to see that, right after, Lexington and Concord, and before any real major battles begin, they're going to start signing up. And in fact, they're going to end up fighting at the very first major battle, the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Battle of Bunker Hill is the first major battle of the American Revolution. Here's where they say the famous, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." And of course, that's because their muskets weren't all that accurate, and the colonists, if you want to call them now patriots, I suppose, these guys did not have a lot of weaponry, a lot of ammunition. So you got to get up close. You got to see the whites of their eyes. So you make sure you hit them. Make sure you do not waste any ammunition. So maybe about 100 black men actually fight at Bunker Hill. A guy named Peter Salem, by the way, who had fought at Lexington already. Notice the name, Peter Salem, right? I haven't really investigated the name, but it's interesting that his name would be Salem. And of course, this is in Massachusetts. So men like Peter Salem, among 100 of them or so, fight at Bunker Hill. Men also act as spies. Black men act as spies. Some of them working as double agents, right? Pretending to work for one side when you're really working for the other. And so a lot of these men will gain freedom after the war. Not all of them. We will come back to that. Not all of black people are going to fight for the colonists. Many northern slaves are going to run away to the British instead. An example of this is a guy named Colonel Ty, who in the North, he's from New Jersey. He's a black man. He actually runs away and joins the British. And he will actually become the leader of the Black Brigade. This is a ranger unit, and rangers, they're the ones that go off, right? They go off, usually on horseback or whatever, looking for stuff. And that's what they do. They plunder the countryside. They go, they hit, villages and towns that are supporting the revolution. They take stuff from them. They take food. They take supplies. They take slaves. And they hand these slaves over. They hand everything over to the British, the food, the supplies, and the slaves. And guess what? They get paid. They get paid for the supplies and the food. And this guy, Colonel Ty, he becomes a wanted man. Of course, they don't get him. He's going to end up dying in battle. But he's an example of how in the North, some decided to actually fight for the British. And so why did these men fight? Well, ideas of freedom, right? And the idea of proving themselves, that their people are a part of the fight for freedom, that their people belong here. And you're going to see this as we move through this course. In fact, black men have fought in all the wars this country has fought since Lexington, and including Lexington. So they're fighting for freedom to prove themselves. They are buying into this idea of the revolution and revolutionary ideas, and they're hoping for the future. They think a man who fights for liberty has a right to liberty. And as I said, a lot of them will win it. All of them. but the revolution will have a tremendous impact on how they see themselves and how they see their own place within this emerging nation. And so Black people look at the revolution and wonder what it means for them. In the years running up to the revolution, they had already kind of become, quote unquote, uppity, not really knowing their place, resisting in all the ways we talked about, right? I'm talking about slaves as well. A lot of slaves running away as war was approaching, because a lot of them, Black free people, slaves, a lot of these people were wondering, what does the war, what does revolution mean for me? We hear all this talk about freedom and about individualism and about taking off the shackles of tyranny. So a lot of slaves even were thought of as not knowing their place and too resistant. You see a lot of people running away. And so what you're going to see is a lot of Black people using the very revolution itself for freedom. They're going to actually use the tools of the white surrounding society. And they're not always going to pick up guns. Some of them pick up pens. The power of the pen, right? You've heard of this, right? The power of the pen is mightier than the sword. And Phyllis Wheatley is an example of this. A woman named Phyllis Wheatley, right? She's a slave, but also a poet. She becomes a poet. She actually, and I think we talked about her already, right, last time, but she points out the hypocrisy of white folk talking about being enslaved by the British and at the same time enslaving other people. She points to people like Thomas Jefferson, who Thomas Jefferson famously said, "We are slaves to the British." Meanwhile, he actually owned slaves. So she's like, what's this about? Phyllis Wheatley, for her part, she takes her pen and she sides with the British. She says England is against slavery. She says England had already outlawed slavery in England itself. That an English court in 1772 actually outlawed slavery in England. Now, we got to be careful with this. And I should have put this up there underneath Phyllis Wheatley's name, but you see it down there under Jenny Slew, the Somerset case. So what she's pointing to, what Phyllis Wheatley is pointing to when she says that England had long before outlawed slavery in 1772, she was pointing to the Somerset case. It's kind of confusing, so I don't really want to go too much into the Somerset case. But in 1772, an English judge actually frees a slave whose owner had taken him to England. So remember, slaves existed throughout the British Empire. If I'm a British dude living in Jamaica with my slave, I take him to England. The question is he still a slave? Given that there's no law in England requiring slavery. Well, the judge says there is no law in England itself, the island, that creates slavery. And slavery can't exist without any law that creates it. Therefore, this person is free. It's kind of confusing. I think you got it, but here's really what you need to know about this, and that is this Somerset case becomes a turning point for the minds of a lot of people. People assume, here's the important piece, people assume that it means England is intent on ending slavery, or even that it has ended slavery in England. And so both sides, people who support the end of slavery and people who are against the end of slavery, both sides are going to look to the Somerset case of 1772 and say, this case is a linchpin. It is a turning point, and we are on our way to ending slavery, whether you like it or whether you don't like it. Now, this is a bit overstated, but people interpreted it as such. And so perception, as we know, is everything in lots of cases. And so Phyllis Wheatley points to this Somerset case, which freed one individual slave only because he was brought to the island where no law requiring slavery existed. But they're using it, and they're using it in favor of ending slavery. slaves are, right? And so Phyllis Wheatley, also a guy named Felix Holbrook in 1773. He's another fellow. He uses the power of the pen. He lives in Massachusetts. Now, notice that all these people are in the North, right, where things are a bit different. I mean, a lot different, I should say, from living in the South. This guy is a slave, Felix Holbrook, and this guy can write. I read his stuff, and maybe I should have asked you to read it, but believe me, he writes very well. And he asks the Massachusetts legislature to outlaw slavery. He argues for the rights of black men. I'm not sure he mentions women, sorry, but he does argue for the rights of black men. And in doing so, when he writes to the Massachusetts legislature, he writes this, very eloquent letter, and he draws on Christianity, humanity, and justice. So he's bringing all these ideas in from the Revolution. And he goes on to say, many black people can become industrious members of society if you free them. Notice he says many. He doesn't say all, which is in itself interesting, because in part of what he says when he writes, he says, there are some people who just can't be helped, but many black people, he says, and I think he'd probably say most, could become industrious members of society. And so they're drawing on the revolutionary language, right? Locke's natural rights, freedom, equality. And a lot of these people are actually, sometimes thinking, well, freedom comes through the British, a la Somerset case. Others think, no, freedom comes through the idea of a new country forming based on natural rights. So, Phyllis Wheatley, she sides with the British. Felix Holbrook, not so sure which side he was on, but if you read his stuff, he's talking about Christianity and humanity and justice, and actually using the language of the Revolution. So when we talk about Black activism and the fight for equality and freedom, we don't usually go back in our thinking today. We don't usually go too much farther than, I don't know, Martin Luther King Jr., a lot of people. Not everybody. I'm sure we can, together name people who came before that. But most people don't place the beginning of Black activism during the Revolutionary War before it. And that's exactly what's happening here. People like Phyllis Wheatley, Felix Holbrook. Okay, just wanted to make sure I was recording because I didn't see I got a weird graphic. Okay, whatever, doesn't matter. I'm recording. Okay. Another way of using the tools of white society isn't just, the pen and the revolutionary language, but it's the revolutionary language and the courts. In fact, you will see a bunch of what are known as freedom suits. For example, Jenny Slew, who was a slave in Massachusetts in 1762. She actually lives as a free mulatto woman in Massachusetts in 1762. Her father was a black man, and she lives as a quote unquote mulatto. Her father was a black man, likely a slave. And so she's living as a free person in Massachusetts when she's snatched up by a white man. I think his name was John Whipple. I don't remember. It doesn't matter. She's snatched up by a white man and forced into slavery. Naturally, she's like, wait a minute. She actually sues this guy for kidnapping. She goes to court and she wins her freedom by showing her mother was a white woman. Because she was a white woman, well, white people can't be slaves in this society, as they're defined. And therefore, she was born of a free person. And because a person's status with regard to slavery is derived from the condition of the mother, if the mother was free, the child was free. Bam. It's a free person. This is the first slave to successfully win a freedom win her freedom through a court suit. And here's where I put Somerset case, but ignore that right there. I will have to move it up to Phyllis Wheatley. Again, guys, I'm putting this stuff together as I go, so it's kind of raw. Apologies. But let's move on with freedom suits. Okay, so Jenny Slew, as I said, right, she wins. You know, she was kidnapped. She was a free woman born to a black man who was likely a slave and a white woman who was free. Therefore, she was free. And she showed it in court. And it's amazing that, you know, the courts at this time would entertain something like this. Slaves are not supposed to have rights in colonial America, English America. But again, this is the North. It's Massachusetts. It's New England. All of these freedom suits will continue as war goes on, as the war begins and goes on. We have, for example, the case of Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mum Bet. She living in Massachusetts, notice the trend. She had suffered slavery for decades, and in 1781, she sues for her freedom in a Massachusetts court. She had heard of the talk of the Declaration of Independence. She had heard of equality. She had heard of life and liberty and all that kind of stuff. And so she gets an attorney to represent her. And the jury sets her free based on the Declaration of Independence, which, interestingly enough, is not even the law of the land, right? At this point, there is no constitution, not really. But there is a statement, the Declaration of Independence, a statement which throws a sort of, blanket over everyone. All men are created equal. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, he says, Thomas Jefferson. Mum Bet will change her name to Elizabeth Freeman. And of course, she's getting away from her slave name and actually embracing and creating for herself a whole new identity. And notice the name Freeman. You're going to see you see a lot of black people today, even with the last name Freeman. Why do you think that is? I think we can guess. All of this, of course, sets the stage for further action. I'll give you another example, Quock Walker. Quock Walker, and by the way, guys, I'm not going to ask you necessarily, who was, born of a white woman and a black man, and who sued in Massachusetts court in 1781. I'm not going to, no, here's what you need to do is think about who, or what, I should say, think about what these people represent. Think about what their actions represent. What I'm giving you guys are examples. What do they show? Excuse me. So we have people who are fighting for freedom, like Quock Walker, also in Massachusetts, sues for his freedom in 1781. In fact, he doesn't just sue for his freedom. He sues for back wages. He says, "You made me work for free, man. You owe me for all that time that I spent working for you. And you actually falsely imprisoned me because you wouldn't let me go. And you beat me when you felt like it." So he wants back wages. He wants damages, meaning money for imprisonment, money for the battery, and of course his freedom. And, when we think about this, guys, we have to recognize something here in that slaves don't have a lot of power. So how are they able to get into court? They're helped by well-meaning white folk. It's something that's often disregarded. There's a lot of white people in the North, particularly among the religious communities, who are helping these people and who file their suits. Quock Walker is helped by religious white folk. And so he goes to court, and his lawyers, we say he argues, but his lawyers are really arguing. He argues that he's a free man. And he should be a free man considering the changes that are going on. Now, what happens? Well, the Massachusetts Supreme Court does something interesting. The Massachusetts Supreme Court looks at its own state constitution. Remember, by this time, right, because the war jumps off really in 1776, right? There are the states, now they're called states, no longer colonies. These states are actually forming their own constitutions. And in doing so, they're writing them up sometimes based on what is happening around them. What do I mean by that? Okay, so the court of Massachusetts looks at the state constitution. And in the state constitution of Massachusetts, it says, quote, all men are born free and equal. All men are born free and equal. Well, the court looks at this and says, okay, all men are born free and equal. Quock Walker is a man. Therefore, because all men are created equal, he is a man. He is therefore free and equal. He wins his case. And in fact, this helps lead to the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts down the road. Interesting point here. Those words about equality, all men are born free and equal, they don't even exist in our U.S. Constitution at this time. In fact, well, they're not going to exist in the U.S. Constitution when it's formed in 1787, I should say. That's my point. The point is that later on, and we're going to get there, later on when they form the Constitution, they don't put anything like this. They don't. A lot of my students get the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution mixed up. The U.S. Constitution never says you have, that all men are born equal. Or that all men are created equal. That doesn't exist in our U.S. Constitution. We got close to it now, but at the time in 1787, when they form it, they don't put this in. And we will flesh this out. Don't get confused by this. Here's the point I want you to get out of this now, and that's that here you have the Massachusetts state constitution saying all men are born free and equal, and the judge saying, well, you must mean him too, because he's a man. Now, I doubt that when the state of Massachusetts formed its constitution, it really meant black folk, but here's what the court says. Yeah, you meant him too. The court didn't have to do this. This is another well-meaning white folk, white man and men who look at this and think, well, I'm going to give this guy the benefit of the doubt against the state. And so you may have noticed that by this time, Northern sentiment is turning against slavery. A lot of people who oppose slavery are pointing to the military service of black men. They're pointing to the fact that by this time, all black men can join the Continental Army. And because of that, and because of their service, they should be freed out of fairness, they say. But also, not just fairness because they're fighting, but also the honor of the new nation that they see forming. And so they point to military service of black men. The opponents do. The opponents point to the revolutionary rhetoric. They say, how is it that we're talking about being enslaved? Look around. Black people are enslaved. We know this is hypocritical. They know it's hypocritical. And then, of course, they point to all the freedom suits. And they say, look, this is what's happening in the North. And so you're seeing in the North a turn away from slavery, largely because of the revolution. And in fact, certain states are taking steps to outlaw it altogether. Vermont in 1777 is the first to outlaw some form of slavery, the first in all of the Western Hemisphere. In doing so, Vermont in 1777 says slavery is, quote, an offense to the new nation. And they go on to say that all persons are born equally free and independent and have certain unalienable rights. Notice something. This is 1777, a year before the Declaration of a year after the Declaration of Independence was signed. So they're taking the language of the Declaration of Independence and putting it into their constitutions, into their state constitutions. But again, the U.S. won't do that down the road. Now, I have to tell you, it's more complicated than to say Vermont completely outlawed slavery in 1777. It did not. We will talk more about that later. But it is the first to outlaw some form of slavery. And in fact, other states in the North in the years to come will do the same. So you see a difference already between North and South. Now, the North is not perfect with regard to race relations. We know that. But it's already on a path that's different from the path that the South is on. Of course, the question is why? Is the North more moral than the South? Or is it just because there was no cash crop in the North, at least not to the extent that these crops existed in the South, vis-a-vis tobacco, right? Rice. But isn't there a difference already between North and South? Didn't different people settle the North than who settled the South? Didn't they settle for different reasons? I'll just give you an example, right? I mean, the North, especially New England, largely settled for religious reasons. And you had people like the Quakers who are already talking about ending slavery. So was it just the fact that the climate didn't make a cash crop feasible, right? Didn't make it so that a cash crop could thrive? Was that the only thing? Or does it have something to do with who came over and settled in the region or the other, and why they settled in the region or the other? I'll leave that to you to think about. But the North is already on a path different from the South. Things are harder in the South for slaves. In the South, Black people are breathing all of this in, right? They understand this whole thing called freedom. And they're not stupid. Even slaves they know of this. As I mentioned before, they have their own sorts of grapevines, right? Gossip grapevines. But freedom in the South is going to be harder to get. Southerners are not going to want to put Black people, which is really pretty much slaves, they don't want to put slaves in the militias. They don't want them in the Continental Army. They're afraid, first of all, of them having guns. Who's to say they just won't turn those guns on us, right? I mean, we're enslaving them. They're just going to rise up. I mean, think about all the rebellions that we're often afraid of. You're going to arm these people now? I don't think so. Also, and this is a little bit more abstract, but they think, we don't want, slaves thinking about freedom and thinking about revolution and thinking about individualism. None of that. So that we'll have a bigger problem on our hands, not just me losing maybe one slave who doesn't come back, but maybe all of them coming back, not just with guns in their hands, but ideas of freedom. So you're not going to see in the South what you see in the North, where Northern Black folk, slaves and freed, are going to be fighting for the Union cause. But when the war comes, Southern slaves actually take sides. Now, most of them are going to side with the British right off the bat, partly because of Somerset's case. Many run away because they believe that England is going to end slavery, because they believe that that's what the Somerset case means, even though in reality it didn't necessarily mean that. They believe that England is going to outlaw slavery in the colonies. Now, the fact that they're running away to the British side means that it's clear to the British, that they can use this to their own advantage. In fact, during the Revolution, you're going to see thousands that will run off to join the British, thousands of slaves. Why? Well, and these are going to be the loyalists, right, fighting for the queen, or excuse me, the crown. You're going to have in 1775, just before the war begins, notice, right, because the war jumps off officially 1776, you're going to see Lord Dunmore. He's the governor of Virginia. He's going to promise that if anyone who is either a slave or indentured, white or Black, runs away and fights for the British, they will be freed. So if you are a slave, which means you're a Black man, and they want you fighting, so you're going to be a man. So if you were a slave and you run away to us to fight with us, we will free you. If you're an indentured servant, white or black, and you run off to fight with us, we're going to free you. Now, most of the people who were doing the work, the labor, who were not exactly free, are slaves. There are a few indentured servants compared to slaves, but it applied to them too. The upshot is that a lot of slaves are going to take advantage of this. They're going to go and get what the British call a certificate of freedom. You come and fight with us. In fact, this results in the creation of what becomes known as the Ethiopian Regiment. It is the very first such force among the British. Now, their duties are going to be, getting, foraging for supplies and food, also going to do some fighting. In fact, Colonel Ty, that guy that I mentioned before that runs off to the British, he will eventually become a member of this regiment, the Ethiopian Regiment, after leading the Black Brigade. So we're going to see thousands of slaves run from the Virginia plantations to fight with the British. And England is going to think, wow, we need to do something else with this. We need to encourage more people to run away. How do we do that? Well, during the height of the war in 1779, we have the Philipsburg Proclamation. I didn't put that in there. It was a guy named Sir Henry Clinton, right? This guy was actually the head of the British forces, and he issues the Philipsburg Proclamation. Philipsburg, Philipsburg. Anyway, Henry Clinton's Philipsburg Proclamation in 1779. It's going to really expand what Dunmore's proclamation did a few years before. Here, what he says is all slaves who run to the British will be freed. Not just those who fight for the British, but all of those slaves who run to the British. What does this mean? Not just men, all slaves. And on the other hand, he says, all slaves caught fighting against the British will be sold back into slavery. Notice the British are not really against slavery per se. What are they doing here? Think about what they're doing here with these proclamations, with Dunmore's proclamation and with Clinton's proclamation. Dunmore, of course, saying, come here and fight and we'll free you. And of course, Clinton saying, you don't have to fight, just come here and we'll free you. But you better not fight against us, right? What's the point of this? Well, both of these proclamations are maneuvers, military maneuvers to hurt the Southerners. And they do hurt the Southerners. They hurt them economically. Agriculture is disrupted, right? They're draining a precious labor source of the South, workers, slaves. So it hurts them economically. It also hurts them militarily. It discourages slave owners and white men from going off to war, especially going off to war to fight somewhere in the north, which is really, really far away. Remember, Dunmore's proclamation was Virginia, right? So there's a lot of slaves there. But of course, now you're going to see, because of Dunmore's proclamation and the Philipsburg Proclamation, a lot of slaves coming from the South. And that means that, not only will agriculture be disrupted, and so the South is hurt economically, but slave owners and white men are not going to go off they're not going to want to go off and fight. Because the idea is, if I am one of these guys, a white man living in the South, slave owner or not, I might think, oh man, slaves might just be running away. If I'm a slave owner, it might be my slave. But even if I'm not a slave owner, what if those slaves are running away and I'm over here fighting and they come across my farm with my sister and my wife and my mother, and they're just going to be raping them left, right, and center. This is how they think. And so a lot of white men do refuse to fight because they want to keep slaves in place and they want to hunt them down before they do, before they commit whatever atrocities they believe that they're capable of committing. On the flip side, though, this actually encourages many Southern states to commit themselves more to war. Because as they see England weakening them militarily and economically through these proclamations, they realize that England, or at least they conclude that England is going to end slavery in the event they win. So it's the colonies must win. They must defeat. A lot of Southerners believe this. The colonies must defeat the British, because if the British win, not only will they free the slaves that they already have that have run over to them, but they might end slavery altogether. It'd be bad enough if they kept the slaves. Now, none of this was very likely. It wasn't likely, I think, that England would outlaw slavery if it were to win. And as far as the slaves that had already run off to them, we're going to see that, in fact, not all of those people end up free. So the Southerners are looking at the proclamations, Dunmore's and Clinton's Phillipsburg Proclamation. They're also looking at the Somerset case and misinterpreting it for sure, but thinking it means the end of slavery if England wins. So all of this has a major effect on the war. All of this will really change the spirit of the revolution. Tens of thousands of slaves are running off, some of them to the British, right? Some of them just to keep going on their own, but they all believe that the revolution means something for them. So you have tens of thousands of slaves running off. Those who run off to the British, some will fight, believing that a British win may end slavery. Some just want to live with the British because they at least will be freed, even if England loses. But there's some who don't even go to the British. They take advantage of everybody leaving, and they take advantage of the fervor of revolution and Dunmore's and Clinton's proclamation, and they just sit on their own. They're not going to take any chances with whoever wins. A lot of them just head north. A lot of them form maroon communities. What's my point? And that is that this revolution is more than just about freedom and from England and so forth. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and it meant a certain something to Black folk. And as it's being fought, people are wondering what the revolution means for the nation that's forming. Now, as war rages, we're going to come to the end of the revolution, and we're not going to get into battles and things. As war rages, England is beginning to wonder toward the 1780s whether the war is worth it. The war is very costly. It's too costly. Their empire is way too big. And by the way, this is only a small part of their empire as they see it. Because remember, the sun never set on the English empire. So the war is costly. Their empire is too big, and it might just be worth it to let this go. And in fact, the colonists just aren't giving up. And they are fighting, and the colonists are fighting guerrilla-type warfare, which they learned during the French and Indian War. They fight like the native folks. England, though, also fears that what they're doing in arming Black men is going to maybe lead to something they can't control. So do they want to continue doing this, putting muskets in the hands of former slaves? Now, on this one, the cat's out of the bag, the horse is out of the barn, use whatever metaphor you want, but they had already unleashed forces, powerful forces, that are going to have an effect on the years to come, in the decades to come, with regard to freedom in the country. England is finally defeated at Yorktown, right? And when this happens, many in the new country are looking to see what that victory will mean for them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What the heck does that mean? It says all men. Now, today, of course, we've broadened that, by the way. But at the time, it says all men, right? Black men. And then, of course, we have Quock Walker, who won his suit, and other people believing that all men means all men. But again, this is not the law. The Declaration of Independence is not the law. It's simply a declaration. but it does talk about all men, and it talks about all of them having inalienable rights. So Black people in this country want to know at this time, what does the revolution mean for me? Okay, people, I am going to stop it right there. And I will begin next time with the limits of the revolution. Thank you for listening, and I hope you're still with me. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out. Thanks. Take care. Bye.